Miss Marple and the Venom in the Vase. Chapter 1. The midday sun filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns onto the polished floorboards of Elmridge Hall. It was the sort of day that dared no one to imagine evil could exist within, a garden full of bees and rose perfume. Yet, as Miss Marple often said, human nature is rather like the weeds. Something unpleasant always finds a way to grow, even in the prettiest beds. In the drawing-room, Lady Cicely Hawthorne poured tea with the grace of a woman who'd never known a misstep. She was hosting her annual Garden Society luncheon, an event feared for its scrutiny as much as it was admired for its cucumber sandwiches. Miss Marple, seated near the windows with a direct view of the sprawling lawn, stirred her tea gently, listening. "Do help yourself to a scone, dear Miss Marple," said Lady Cicely, her diamond brooch winking in the light. "Cook has gone positively mad with the lemon curd this year." "You're very kind," Miss Marple replied. She didn't reach for the scone. She was watching. Out on the lawn, a heated conversation flickered between Mr. Roland Fielding, the new vicar, young and earnest, and Miss Venetia Blake, a pale woman with hands too still and eyes too quick. Their voices were low, but their body language betrayed more than they knew. She touched his sleeve as he stepped away. He did not look back. Inside, the air remained cloyingly sweet. Lady Cicely turned to the group. "I must say, I do worry about the foxglove. Such an aggressive plant. I told our groundskeeper not to replant it near the conservatory. It doesn't belong near the lilies." Mrs. Grafton, the baker's wife, and an inveterate eavesdropper, nodded with false concern. "Some plants should stay buried," she murmured, though no one asked what she meant. Across the room, Colonel Bryce yawned theatrically. "We're being dramatic, ladies. It's only a bit of horticulture, not war." His eye lingered a moment too long on Miss Venetia as she entered flushed and silent. Then the room shifted. As the guests began to gather their things for the garden tour, hosted each year by the late Sir Lionel's prized walk among the camellias, Miss Marple stood and reached instinctively toward the vase on the mantel, a simple porcelain vessel filled with fresh lilies. She did not touch it, just noted something faint and odd, a smell beneath the sweetness. She said nothing. Later that evening, Lady Cicely died in her sleep. A stroke, the doctor would say. Peaceful, sudden, natural. But when Miss Marple heard the news the next morning, she only nodded, her voice soft. Oh dear, she always had the most exquisite taste in lilies. And as she set down her embroidery and asked her maid for the train schedule to Elmridge, no one thought to wonder why the look in her eyes was not surprise, but confirmation. Chapter. Shoo, rain fell softly the next morning, misting the hedgerows and dabbing sorrow onto the shutters of Elmridge Hall. The flag outside the village post office flew at half-mast, a quaint gesture organised by Councillor Appleby, who insisted the village show appropriate decorum after Lady Cicely's passing. At the vicarage, Mr. Roland Fielding had trouble with his sermon. His hands moved across the draft in uneven lines, ink blotting in places where his thoughts wandered. A glance at the mantel clock told him he was late. He was due to offer comfort to the bereaved staff at Elmridge. He wasn't the only visitor heading that way. Miss Marple, umbrella in hand, stood at the iron gate just after 10, The hall's grand stone face looked unchanged, but there was a weight in the air, a hush that felt heavier than grief. It was the silence of something unsettled. She was greeted by Frances, the housemaid, who looked too pale for the early hour. "We weren't expecting you, Miss Marple," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "No one ever is," Miss Marple replied gently. "But I thought I might bring some sponge cake to the staff. It's the sort Lady Cicely liked." Frances stepped aside, and Miss Marple entered the dim hallway. On the table near the stairs stood the vase of lilies, still fresh, still fragrant. She paused before it. "You've not cleared the flowers," she noted. "No, miss. Mrs. Venn, housekeeper, thought it would be wrong to move anything. Not yet. It all feels strange." Miss Marple nodded. "Where is she now?" "In the drawing-room, miss, with the vicar. And, oh, Miss Venetia's here too. She arrived very early. Said she wanted to sit in the quiet. Inside the drawing-room, the air was taut with restraint." Miss Venetia stood near the window, hands clasped behind her back, eyes fixed on the drizzle beyond. Roland Fielding sat opposite her, posture rigid. Mrs. Venn hovered in the corner, her expression wary. "I didn't know she had a heart condition," Venetia was saying. "None of us did." "She didn't," murmured the vicar. Miss Marple stepped in quietly. "I do hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, Miss Marple," said Mrs. Venn with a strange smile. "We were just remembering her ladyship." "Such a loss," Venetia said quickly, though her voice lacked the warmth expected. "And so sudden." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the tea-tray on the table. Freshly used. 3 cups. 1 saucer bore a faint yellow stain near the edge. She said nothing of it. Instead, she turned to Mrs. Venn. "Did anyone else visit last night, after the garden party?" "Just the doctor, Dr. Eltham. Came straight away after cook found her, cold and still. She hadn't rung for anyone." The vicar interjected. "He said it was the heart. Nothing to be done." Venetia turned. "Why, does everyone keep saying sudden? She was fine yesterday, sharp as ever. You saw her, Miss Marple." "I did," Miss Marple replied gently. "And yes, she was quite herself." No one spoke for a long moment. Then Miss Marple added, "Did she take her tea last night, do you know?" Mrs. Venn nodded. "She always did. Wanted it in the drawing-room at 7. The maid brought it in, same as always." "She drank it all?" I believe so." "Curious," Miss Marple said softly. "Why curious?" Venetia asked, voice a little too quick. "Oh, no reason, merely thinking aloud." She smiled. "In my experience, small habits often persist, even when the world changes." Outside, the rain lightened. Miss Marple departed with a kind farewell, and as the door shut behind her, the tension in the drawing-room broke. Venetia turned on the vicar. "She suspects something. She didn't say anything." "She never does," Venetia murmured. "Not until she's sure." In the hallway, Frances peered from the shadows, watching them. Her lips moved silently. Then she vanished up the stairs. By dusk, the village was buzzing, quietly, discreetly, as it always did in the face of death. At the grocer's, Mrs. Grafton whispered that Lady Cicely had seemed off during the luncheon. At the post office, someone mentioned she had argued with Venetia in hushed tones over lunch. At the Rose and Thistle, Colonel Bryce had 3 whiskies and declared it was undoubtedly the stress of her charitable work that did her in. And through it all, Miss Marple sat by her window with a cup of weak tea and her knitting untouched. The lilies had smelled wrong. The vicar's sleeve had been touched, and someone had taken great care not to move the vase at all. Chapter 3. The ivy-covered walls of Elmridge Hall held their breath as visitors came and went in murmured grief. 2 days had passed since Lady Cicely's passing, yet the village's sorrow hadn't settled. It hovered like a fog, light but inescapable. Miss Marple arrived at the churchyard just before noon. A light breeze tugged at her scarf as she stood beneath a yew tree, eyes on the freshly turned earth. No headstone yet, only a brass plaque temporarily fixed to a wooden cross. Cicely Hawthorne, beloved patron, friend to the village. She never missed Sunday service, came a voice behind her. Mr. Fielding, sleeves rolled up, spade in hand. I imagine she didn't, Miss Marple said. A woman of rhythms, your Lady Hawthorne, the sort who keeps the postman punctual just by glancing at the clock. The vicar gave a thin smile. Yes, though lately she'd seemed unsettled. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. She was upset with Venetia, he added. After the luncheon they argued in the conservatory. Something about the old accounts for the Garden Society. Venetia had apparently made a change without consulting her. Change? A withdrawal? £40, I think. Venetia claimed it was for a charity event, but Lady Cicely felt blindsided. Money makes a poor fertilizer for friendship, Miss Marple mused. Still, not usually enough to poison lilies. The vicar turned sharply. You think she was poisoned? Miss Marple gave him a long, kind look. I think lilies do not give off aniseed, and tea does not stain that shade of yellow unless something quite particular is added. He paled. Of course, she added smoothly. I could be mistaken. At the same hour, Venetia Blake stood in the morning room at Hawthorne Cottage, her gloved fingers tracing the frame of a photograph. Her and Lady Cicely, arm in happier days. Mrs. Venn was with her, folding linen slowly, her back to the room. I didn't expect you'd stay this long, she said. Venetia didn't answer at first. It doesn't feel right leaving. No, Mrs. Venn replied. It wouldn't, would it? Venetia turned. You mean something by that? The housekeeper paused, then folded another cloth. I mean only what's true. You and her ladyship hadn't spoken properly in weeks. Not until the garden party. Venetia's mouth tightened. She was stubborn. She was frightened. That landed. Venetia's voice softened. Do you really think it wasn't natural? Mrs. Venn looked up at her then, measured, unreadable. I think when the dead leave us questions, the living must answer them. That afternoon, a constable arrived at Miss Marple's cottage with a brown paper envelope. From Dr. Elton, ma'am. He asked I deliver it personally. Miss Marple nodded, took the parcel, and thanked him with a smile. She did not open it. Right away. She placed it beside her knitting and went out into the garden, where the wind teased the clothesline, and the scent of rosemary lingered in the air. Only when she returned did she unwrap the envelope. Inside, a page torn from a medical notebook. And a tiny vial, empty, corked, clean. The note read no toxicology yet. But Cicely's blood showed mild traces of conine. Not lethal in small amounts and less concentrated over time. Most likely administered via infusion. The lilies? Unlikely. But the tea? Possible. Will update once tests return. Dr. E. Miss Marple placed the vial carefully back into the envelope. Conine, hemlock, a rare choice. Old-fashioned and not easy to source, unless one knew their plants. By twilight she was at the apothecary. Mr. Spindle, a lean man with a dandelion, moustache and an encyclopedic knowledge of dangerous herbs, raised a brow at her arrival. "I wonder," Miss Marple began mildly, "if you've had any recent customers asking after spotted hemlock or its kin?" Mr. Spindle scratched his chin. "Not in years, Miss Marple. Nasty stuff. People don't ask for it unless they've a death wish, or a wicked novel to write." She nodded. "Of course, but you would keep a ledger, I expect, for rare requests." "Do under the counter." "Would it be terribly improper of me to ask if Miss Venetia Blake's name appears in the last 2 months?" He blinked. Then quietly he reached for the ledger. An hour later, Miss Marple sat once more by her fire, the rain pattering outside in slow rhythm. Her eyes drifted to her unopened newspaper. Her thoughts were elsewhere. Someone had sourced poison. Someone had brewed it. Someone had counted on no one noticing. But someone had also made a mistake. Miss Marple lifted her cup of tea, plain, unsweetened, and sipped. Not a strong enough dose to kill, not in one go. But if administered over several evenings, yes, very possible. Chapter 4. The next morning brought a rare burst of sunlight to St. Elmswood, drying the village green and sending a sparkle across dew-covered windows. But beneath the surface brightness, something darker crept in silence. At number 12 Thistle Lane, the postmistress, Dora Melling, sorted letters with unusual care. Her fingers hesitated over a small white envelope, cream-stocked and scented faintly of lavender. It was addressed to Miss Venetia Blake, Elmridge Hall, temporary. The handwriting was unfamiliar. Neat, deliberate, masculine. Dora narrowed her eyes. She wasn't one to pry, of course, but there were instincts, old and unerring, that told her something wasn't quite right. She waited until the morning rush was over before slipping into the back and telephoning Miss Marple. Within the hour, Miss Marple was seated behind the post-counter, sipping tea from a chipped daffodil cup. Dora leaned forward conspiratorially. "It arrived this morning. Hand-posted, no stamp. Dropped through the outer slot between midnight and 7. I found it lying oddly, wedged half under the mat. And no one saw who delivered it. A soul." Miss Marple lifted the envelope delicately, examining the corner. "This corner's been creased, and the flap resealed." Dora flushed slightly. "It arrived open, torn a little. Naturally, I didn't read it." "Naturally," Miss Marple echoed, folding the letter gently and returning it. "You've done the right thing, Dora. Let it be delivered. But do let me know if Miss Blake responds or appears upset." Dora nodded solemnly. "She always looks upset, but lately it's sharper, like she's expecting a ghost." That afternoon, Miss Venetia stood alone at the edge of Elmridge's upper garden. The wind stirred the hem of her dress, and in her hands, trembling slightly, was the letter. Mrs. Venn watched her from the drawing-room window, one hand resting on the sill, expression unreadable. Down by the lilacs, Colonel Bryce approached. "From the lane. Out early," he said. His tone was casual, but his eyes flicked to the paper in her hand. "I needed air," Venetia replied. "Or answers." She stiffened. "What do you mean?" The Colonel shrugged. "Only that I've seen that look before. In wartime, mostly. It's what people wear when they know too much, or not nearly enough." Venetia turned away. "You should keep your metaphors to yourself, Colonel." "I will, once the truth stops needing them." Meanwhile, Miss Marple visited the church vestry, where Roland Fielding sorted hymnals with mechanical precision. "You seem unsettled," she remarked, setting down a small packet of violets. I've been thinking about Venetia," he admitted. "She's not herself." "She rarely is when alone," Miss Marple said gently. "But she's not alone, is she?" The vicar paused. "She told me something last year," he said quietly, "after her return from abroad, that she'd gotten into some difficulty with money, borrowed against an inheritance that never came. Lady Cicely found out? She did. Paid it quietly, on the condition Venetia stepped back from the Garden Society finances. That was why the withdrawal last week surprised her. It was a betrayal. Did Lady Cicely confront her? Yes, that afternoon. But she kept it from the others. Said she didn't want to ruin Venetia's standing in the village. "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. "Kindness can be such a dangerous thing." By evening, something else stirred the air. Frances, the maid at Elmridge, crept to the stables with a parcel wrapped in brown oilcloth. She moved quickly, glancing over her shoulder, as though the roses themselves might whisper her secret. Inside the tack room, she pulled open a loose plank in the floorboards. Beneath, among cobwebs and mouse droppings, was a small tin box. She slid the parcel inside, shut the lid and replaced the wood, unseen, unheard, or so she thought. A shadow moved behind the hay cart, and in the loft above someone held their breath. Miss Marple, in her cottage on Church Lane, stared at her mantel clock as the last chimes of 8 rang out. She returned to her notebook, a simple thing with a pressed flower between the pages, and reread her entries. Conneen confirmed possible gradual dosage. Venetia. Motive. Plus opportunity. Money. T. Common link. Vase untouched. Why? Francis. Watching. Hiding something. She underlined the last point. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, letter. Fear. But not fear of the murder, fear of exposure. She closed the book and turned out the lamp. Tomorrow she would take a walk through the garden, and not all secrets buried beneath ivy were meant to stay hidden. Chapter 5. The next day broke over St. Elmswood with the quiet of a held breath. A pale morning sun brushed the rooftops, but the village stirred sluggishly, burdened not by mourning, but by uncertainty. At Elmridge Hall the drawing-room had been cleared for visitors. Not many came. A few ladies from the parish brought shortbread and condolences. Mr. Fielding read psalms in a subdued voice. Venetia hovered near the fireplace, arms folded tightly, her lips a thin line. She spoke little. She watched everything. Mrs. Marple arrived just before noon, a small tin of lemon biscuits in hand. Francis opened the door. Still taking tea, I see, Miss Marple asked lightly, noting the tray already half laid. We are, Frances replied. Habit, I suppose. Habits are like ivy. They cling until the walls fall down. Frances blinked but said nothing. Miss Marple entered, setting the tin down. Forgive the intrusion, she said gently to Venetia. I thought perhaps a small kindness might do more than all the sermons. Venetia nodded, her voice hoarse. I don't know if anything helps. Sometimes merely sharing a table does, Miss Marple replied. She sat. Her eyes drifted to the teacups. 3 again. 1 already poured, still steaming. Mrs. Venn entered moments later, her hands red, from washing. Pardon me, I didn't know we'd be having visitors. Only the usual, Miss Marple said calmly. Though I must admit I'm curious who prefers the ginger blend today. Frances turned slightly. That would be me, miss. Ah, and Venetia? Plain Assam, Venetia replied without looking up. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Just as Lady Cicely liked. That got a reaction. The air thickened for a second, sharp and brief. The conversation shifted. Did Lady Cicely ever complain of headaches? Miss Marple asked, stirring her tea slowly. Venetia shook her head. Never. She was remarkably healthy. And yet she passed so suddenly. I believe Dr. Eltham was puzzled too. I didn't know that, Mrs. Venn said quickly. The doctor said it was natural. Doctors often do, until something says otherwise. The silence that followed was almost defiant. Later, Miss Marple walked alone through the lower garden, tracing the old path past the yew hedges. A robin trilled somewhere above, and the scent of earth hung rich in the air. She paused at the conservatory. Its glass pane cracked slightly near the top, moss creeping into the corners. She remembered Lady Cicely's voice, sharp and amused at last week's luncheon. That ivy's a menace, but Frances insists it lends charm. Frances again. She turned, following the wall, until it ended behind the garden shed. There, in a patch of turned soil, something glinted beneath a spray of forget-me-nots. Miss Marple knelt slowly. A teaspoon, slightly tarnished, floral-handled, and deeply scratched. She did not touch it. She only looked, and then made her way calmly back to the house. That evening, Miss Marple requested an audience with Dr. Eltham. He welcomed her into his study with a tired sigh. "You're not convinced it was natural, are you?" "I seldom am when lilies smell like licorice and spoons appear buried in flower beds." He blinked. "Spoons? I found one today, scratched, old, discarded, possibly unnoticed for years, or possibly used recently. Would you be willing to test the surface?" "You can try," he said, "though there's no guarantee." "There rarely is, Doctor. But I've learned that poisoners are like magicians. They rely on the audience not looking where they should." He sat back. "You believe she was murdered?" "I believe someone thought a lingering death might go unnoticed in a house filled with routine. That's always the gamble, isn't it? That no one will see the difference between natural and arranged. And the motive?" Miss Marple paused. "Still unclear. But I believe one thread leads to money, another to guilt, and perhaps a third to shame." She stood to leave. As she reached the door, she turned. "By the way, do let me know if anyone else has asked you for sedatives recently. particularly any among the household staff. Dr. Eltham looked startled. You think it wasn't Venetia? I didn't say that. I simply think guilt is rarely a solo performance. That night, Francis entered the stables again, but this time the parcel was gone, and in its place a folded slip of paper. I know what you hid. Don't speak to anyone, or it won't be your secret anymore. Her breath hitched. Behind her, a hayloft board creaked, and somewhere across the garden, a figure watched from the shadows, still as stone, until the light in Francis's window flickered. Chapter 6. The garden at Elmridge had changed. It was still orderly, still exquisite, but the air had turned. There was a silence between the hedges, a heaviness to the soil, as though the roots themselves whispered secrets no one dared to voice aloud. Miss Marple wandered its paths the next morning under the pretext of admiring the late-blooming delphiniums, but her eyes were not on the petals. They were on the footprints, faint but clear. One set, small, narrow, circled round the edge of the lily bed. Another, deeper, stopped by the bench near the stone fountain. She knelt briefly beside the rose arbour. A scrap of fabric, torn and earth-stained, peeked from the underbrush. Navy wool, tucked hastily. She did not pocket it, not yet. Instead, she continued to the stables. Inside, the air was warm and sour with hay and iron. Francis was there, brushing down one of the older mares, her movements jerky, unfocused. "Lovely morning," Miss Marple said. Francis startled. "Miss Marple, oh, I didn't hear you." Quiet work often invites louder thoughts. Francis avoided her gaze. "Just trying to stay busy." "Of course." A pause. "I hear you've taken to the garden shed lately." "A peaceful spot." Francis went still. "Who told you that?" "No one. But I saw the soil under your nails. And there was something missing this morning from the usual path. Your footsteps were there, but the hedge gate had no dew. Suggests someone passed through earlier, wiped it down after." Francis's lip trembled. "I haven't done anything wrong." Miss Marple studied her gently. "Francis, secrets grow like brambles. Best to trim them before they wrap around your throat." Francis turned away. "I didn't kill her. I don't think you did. But someone thinks I know who did." There it was. Miss Marple's voice lowered. "Someone threatened you?" Francis nodded. "A note left where the parcel was. I only hid it because found it after the garden party in the conservatory." "What was in it?" "A scarf and a silver spoon with yellow residue. I didn't know what to do. I thought if the police found it, they'd blame me." Miss Marple placed a hand on the girl's arm. "Francis, you've done the hardest thing already. You've survived someone's fear. Now let's ensure no one else pays for their silence." Dijik. At the vicarage, Mr. Fielding stared at a wilted bouquet by the window. Miss Marple had requested a word in private. "I must ask something difficult," she began. "You spoke of Venetia's financial trouble. But was she truly alone in it?" The vicar frowned. "What do you mean?" "I've learned she withdrew funds shortly before Lady Cicely's death. But that money, £40, isn't untraceable. Someone helped her process the paperwork." He hesitated. "You think I helped her? I think someone did, and I think they now regret it." He stood. "I witnessed the form, but I didn't know she forged the second signature. I only learned afterward. And told no one. She begged me. She said she needed the money to pay a man threatening to expose her for a past affair. Said if Cicely found out, she'd be ruined. And yet, Cicely did find out. He sank back down. That's why they fought. Venetia didn't deny it. She cried in the pews for an hour afterward. I thought she was ashamed. Now I wonder if it was fear. Fear and shame often share the same mask, Miss Marple said softly, but only one of them kills. By evening, Colonel Bryce paid a visit to the post office, ostensibly for stamps, but in truth for gossip. Dora Melling, never one to withhold a kernel of truth, leaned in. "She's been here twice this week," Dora whispered, referring to Venetia. "And both times she asked whether the post had been intercepted. Said something about a missing letter. Looked positively haunted." "A missing letter," Bryce echoed, "from someone she didn't name." "But it matters. I've seen enough of these dramas to know, whatever she received that morning." It shook her. Miss Marple ended her evening beside her window. The garden, bathed in violet dusk. She opened her notebook. Francis, shaken, frightened witness. Parcel hidden, not planted. Vicar, witnessed falsified document. Regretful, not malicious. Venetia, cornered financially and emotionally. Motive exists, but method, missing letter, deal vital. Threat, confession. She tapped the page once, twice, then circled one word, intercepted. Someone had written to Venetia. Someone who knew something, or feared something would be uncovered. And now that letter had vanished. Miss Marple looked to the garden once more. Not all routes led to murder, but all truths, she knew, eventually grew toward the light. Chapter 7. By midweek, the village had begun to breathe again. The polite conversations returned to lace doilies and new hat trims. The grocer's window changed from black ribbon to early summer. Tomatoes. Elmridge Hall, though still draped in mourning, resumed its quiet rhythm, frayed but functional. Only Miss Marple noticed that Venetia Blake had not left the house in 3 days, and only Miss Marple noticed that Colonel Bryce had begun, walking past the hall at peculiar hours, neither late enough for a night stroll nor early enough for morning errands. It was as if the village had learned to pretend again, until the scream came. It shattered the illusion of peace just after tea-time. Mrs. Venn's cry echoed through the stone corridors of Elmridge. Frances found her first, collapsed near the base of the staircase, her apron clutched in one fist, her eyes fixed on the study door. Behind that door, slumped across Lady Cicely's writing desk, was Colonel Bryce. Dead, no blood, no visible wound, just the scent of bitter almonds in the air, faint but unmistakable. Inspector Drayle, summoned within the hour, stood with furrowed brows and a faintly accusatory tone. "You again, Miss Marple? I do seem to have the misfortune of frequent proximity to corpses," she said calmly, "though I assure you I've never been responsible for one." He harumphed and turned to the body. No sign of struggle, nothing stolen. But this, he held up the teacup. "Almonds," Miss Marple said softly, "or rather the faint trace of cyanogenic compounds. Possibly cyanide. Bitter almond is its ghost. Drayle glanced at her. "You're quick." "Only where poison is concerned. It rarely walks alone." In the drawing-room, Venetia clutched the arm of the settee, her knuckles white. "He was here to speak with me," she whispered. "Said he had something to tell me, something urgent." "And what was that?" Drayle asked. "I don't know. He never got to it." Frances, nearby, fidgeted with a handkerchief. Miss Marple noted her shoes, mud-streaked. "You walked through the garden?" she asked. Frances looked up. "Yes, miss. The back door was jammed again. I went around the side." "Before or after Colonel Bryce arrived?" "After. I saw him come through the front just past 4. "And you heard nothing strange? Only the tray falling when he dropped the cup." Mrs. Venn entered pale and silent. "He asked for Lady Cicely's ledger," she said, her voice oddly distant. "Said he needed to check a record from last spring. I fetched it from the cabinet in the parlour." "And was Miss Blake present?" Miss Marple asked. "No. She was upstairs with the vicar. He'd come to offer prayers." "Did Colonel Bryce drink anything before you left?" "Only the tea I'd brought him. I made it fresh." Miss Marple turned. "With the same blend as Lady Cicely's last cup, I presume?" Mrs. Venn's jaw twitched. "We only keep 1 tin." Drayle muttered something and made a note. Miss Marple looked to Frances. "And the teacup?" "In the kitchen now. I didn't know what to do." "You did the right thing," Miss Marple said softly. "No need to touch anything further. That night the village could no longer pretend. 2 deaths, both seemingly peaceful, both tied to a cup of tea." Miss Marple sat at her writing table well into the early hours, her candle sputtering low. She flipped back through her notes. Lady Cicely argued with Venetia. Colonel Bryce hinted at wartime experience, understood pressure. Frances, she's hiding evidence, now threatened. Vicar, she's moral burden, not motive. Missing letter, still unrecovered. Second poisoning. Escalation or silencing. She tapped her pencil once, then again. Colonel Bryce asked for the ledger. Lady Cicely's ledger. She rose and crossed to her cabinet. From her earlier visit she had borrowed a page, unnoticed by Mrs. Venn, from the margin of the ledger. A half-torn column with entries scratched in haste. Among them, March 12th, 25, cash withdrawn, initials unreadable. March 19th, receipt for tonic order, spindle. March 27th, entry crossed out, that last line, crossed out, with force. Why? What had Lady Cicely recorded that someone desperately needed erased? In the stable loft, someone else wasn't sleeping. Frances lay on her side, clutching her pillow, eyes red-rimmed. She wasn't thinking of Colonel Bryce. She was thinking of the scarf, and the fact that she had told no one it was embroidered. With the initials VB, and that now, just this evening, it had vanished from the tin box entirely. Miss Marple extinguished her candle, the garden rustled outside. A wind had picked up, and somewhere in the dark, someone was deciding whether to strike again. But Miss Marple knew now. The garden hadn't grown the poison. It had only hidden it. Chapter 8. The next morning, the ivy on Elmridge's southern wall stirred in the wind, curling like green fingers around the cracked bricks. Beneath its shade, silence clung thick as the mist. 2 deaths now, and still no answers, only unease that grew with every passing hour. Miss Marple arrived just after, 10, walking slowly, as if taking in the flowers. In truth, she was watching the house. She noted it at once. A window, ajar, the study window. It had been locked the day before. Inside, Inspector Drayle paced with growing impatience. "I'll have to question every member of the household again," he muttered, flipping through his notes. "This time thoroughly. Someone's hiding something, and I don't like being made a fool of." Miss Marple set down her gloves. "Then perhaps don't begin from the assumption that the most frightened person is the most guilty." He gave her a sideways glance. She continued, "You've asked about fingerprints and shoe prints, but you haven't asked who knew Colonel Adeti. Bryce once led a military intelligence unit during the war." Drayle blinked. "What does that have to do with poison?" "Everything," she said simply, "because poison is the coward's weapon, unless it's chosen to confuse." In the kitchen, Francis scrubbed furiously at a clean plate. Miss Marple entered without a word and sat. Francis kept her back turned. "If you're here to ask about the scarf, I don't have it." "I know. It's gone. Just like the letter Venetia received, and the vial Dr. Eltham loaned me last week, from Lady Cicely's examination. Someone's cleaning up." Francis paused. "You think someone saw me hide it?" "I think someone wanted it hidden so they could later retrieve it. And you were the perfect errand girl." Francis turned, voice shaking. "I didn't mean to get anyone hurt." "You didn't. But someone else did." Francis sat down slowly, her hands limp. "And I saw Colonel Bryce with Venetia the night before Lady Cicely died. In the garden, they argued. Did you hear what was said?" "Only snatches. Something about too late to fix it now, and you think money solves guilt." Miss Marple leaned forward. "And what did Venetia say?" She said, "You owe me silence, not judgment." Then she left. Later, in the conservatory, Venetia herself stared out through misted glass. The roses beyond swayed gently. Her tea sat untouched beside her. Miss Marple entered quietly. Venetia didn't turn. "I know what you're going to ask," Miss Marple folded her hands. "You do. You think I poisoned Cicely, that I killed Colonel Bryce to cover it up. I think you're terrified, and terrified people often make poor decisions, but not always fatal ones." Venetia exhaled, long and shallow. She knew. "Cicely. About my debts. The man who threatened to expose me. He was a bluff. There was no affair. I made it up to get the money, but I never expected her to die. And Colonel Bryce?" Venetia's voice broke. "He said he found something in her ledger, that someone else had withdrawn money after she died, forged days after. He thought it was me, but it wasn't. Do you know who?" "No, but someone wanted me blamed." Miss Marple studied her a moment, then rose. "You may not be lying, Miss Blake, but you are omitting something, and omissions are the ivy on truth. They may not kill it, but they obscure it long enough for rot to set in. That evening Dr. Eltham arrived at Miss Marple's cottage with a small brown envelope. "I finished the test on the spoon," he said. "Trace amounts of conine, same as before. You were right." "Thank you," she replied. "I wonder, Doctor, would you remember? Has anyone in the village requested sleeping tonics recently? He frowned. Yes, actually, just after Lady Cicely died, Mrs. Venn. Did she give a reason? She said she'd been having nightmares. Grief, she claimed. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And the date of the prescription? April 3rd, 3 days before the second poisoning. Miss Marple visited the hall again just before sunset. The garden was quiet, the study window now latched. She found Mrs. Venn in the parlour, folding linens. "I wonder," Miss Marple began, "whether you've found anything unusual missing lately." Mrs. Venn hesitated. "What sort of thing?" "Papers, receipts, a scarf, perhaps." "No," she said too quickly. "Nothing I can recall." Miss Marple walked slowly toward the fireplace, where ivy had begun to curl through a cracked sill. "Funny," she said softly. "The last entry in Lady Cicely's ledger was crossed out violently. But someone had to see it first to know it needed crossing out." Mrs. Venn stiffened. Miss Marple turned. "You once told Venetia that Cicely was frightened, not upset, not betrayed, frightened. What was she afraid of?" Mrs. Venn looked down. "It wasn't Venetia. It was her brother." "Brother? Yes. He came to Elmridge weeks ago. Quiet visit. No one knew. Cicely was shaken after. Said she was correcting an old mistake. Then the next week she made a change to her will." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "And where is he now?" Mrs. Venn's voice dropped. "No one's seen him since. She never told us his name." Miss Marple left without another word. But her thoughts were loud. A forged signature. A hidden visit. A brother erased from record. Not all poison comes in cups. Some comes in inheritance. Chapter 9. The notion of a secret visitor unsettled Miss Marple more than she let on. In St. Elmswood, news of a long-lost relative appearing unannounced would ordinarily send gossip flying like crows from a ploughed field. Yet no one had mentioned a man arriving or leaving Elmridge in the weeks before Lady Cicely's death, which meant he had arrived quietly, and he had left the same way, if he had left at all. At the parish archives that morning, Miss Marple requested access to the old Hawthorne family records. The archivist, Mr. Lennox, a precise man with horn-rimmed spectacles and a faint aroma of old glue, helped her sort through the marriage and birth ledgers. After half an hour, she found what she needed. Hawthorne, Cicely Ann, B. 1878. Hawthorne, Edwin Charles, B. 1875. Died 1901. Discrepancy noted in estate will. Estate revised 1902. Cicely named sole heir. Edwin listed missing, presumed deceased. Presumed, Miss Marple repeated aloud. Lennox peered over. Odd case, that. Edwin left England in 1899, supposedly to South Africa. Never confirmed dead. His name turned up again in a shipping log from Marseille in 03. Cicely tried to contest it, but nothing came of it legally. So his return would complicate the will. Considerably, Lennox said, especially if there's no death certificate, no body, just an assumption. By early afternoon she was back in the apothecary. Mr. Spindle was polishing a set of brass weights when she entered. "Miss Marple," he said, "you'll forgive me. I've not stocked any more of the foxglove tincture you inquired about earlier." "I'm here for something else today," she replied. "I wonder if anyone's been asking for medicines under false names." Spindle blinked. "False names?" or unusual ones, men in particular, someone asking after strong sedatives or bitter compounds, possibly claiming to be a relative of Lady Cicely's. He frowned. Well, there was one, 3 weeks ago. Older gentleman, polite, dressed well, but odd. Said he needed laudanum for a sick sister. Signed the register as E. Hawthorne. I thought it a coincidence. Miss Marple nodded. Did he say where he was staying? Just with family. No address. Paid in coin. Gold sovereigns. Very old-fashioned, Miss Marple murmured. Exactly. That's what struck me. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple took out her notebook. Edwin Charles Hawthorne, presumed dead, reappeared, sought laudanum, possibly forged signature on posthumous account, motivation, inheritance restoration, but blocked by Cicely's revised will. She underlined blocked, and then circled ledger entry, crossed out. Perhaps Cicely had recorded Edwin's reappearance. Perhaps Bryce found it, realized what it meant, and someone else realized he had. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat with Dr. Eltham in his study. He had agreed to meet after hours. Curiosity had clearly gotten the better of him. "I wonder, Doctor," she asked, "would you happen to have Lady Cicely's last will? Or rather, a copy of the one filed in March?" He rose, opened a locked drawer, and removed a thin folder. "I received it just before she passed. It was never officially lodged, but she asked me to witness it. And did you?" "Yes." Miss Marple read through the pages. Most of the estate was to be left to charity. Venetia received a modest stipend, but one clause stood out. No, claim shall be honoured by or on behalf of Edwin Charles Hawthorne, formerly presumed deceased, whose conduct renders him unworthy of inheritance. Miss Marple sat back. "So she knew." Dr. Eltham frowned. "But how did she know he was back?" "She must have spoken to him, or received a letter. But someone else knew too, and feared what she would do next. That night, Venetia found herself unable to sleep. The hallway creaked with night wind and memory. Downstairs, the study light was still on. She descended barefoot, robe tight around her. Inside, the fire was low. A figure stood by the desk, rifling through papers. She gasped. "Who?" The figure turned. "Francis, I thought you were asleep," Venetia whispered. "I couldn't. Francis's eyes flicked to the ledger. "I needed to see." "See what?" "The name." Francis's voice trembled. "I heard Mrs. Venn once, years ago, talking to Cicely about someone they had to pretend was gone. A disgrace to the family. I thought it was a story. But now I wonder if it was him. If he came back." Venetia stepped closer. "Francis, why didn't you say something sooner?" "Because people are dying," she whispered, "and I think whoever's behind it isn't done yet." Behind them, the wind groaned against the shutters. At the same moment, Miss Marple stood in her garden, looking toward Elmridge Hall. A shadow passed behind one of the upper windows. Someone was in the house who should not have been, not Francis, not Venetia. Someone whose name had been scrubbed from memory, but who had come back, not to claim, to punish. Chapter 10. The name Edwin Charles Hawthorne had vanished from village memory, the way a scandal does when no one dares speak it aloud. Buried, misremembered, deliberately left out of family stories. But Miss Marple had long understood. What people forget is often more revealing than what they remember. And now, with a second death behind them and the shadow of a third flickering closer, forgetting was no longer an option. The next morning, she requested a meeting with Inspector Drayle. He arrived at her cottage promptly, the lines around his mouth deeper than usual. "I've gone over the staff again," he said. "Francis is spooked, the housekeeper's evasive, and Venetia, she's fraying." Miss Marple nodded. "You won't find your culprit among the names on the Hall's payroll, but you might among those who were never supposed to be written down at all." She handed him the page from the parish archives. Drayle read the marginalia, then looked up sharply. Cicely had a brother, thought to be dead. More accurately, she corrected, presumed dead by convenience. He disappeared, yes, but not before falling out with the family over something Cicely never quite forgave. Drayle frowned. "And you believe he came back?" "He did come back, under a false pretence, with a borrowed name, collecting laudanum from the apothecary, possibly hiding in the west wing of the estate. If I'm correct, in the old nursery wing that's been unused for years." Drayle blinked. "And where is he now?" Miss Marple stirred her tea. "That, Inspector, is the question I believe we must answer before he kills again." At Elmridge Hall, Venetia stood with Francis outside the locked study door. The ledger was gone. Francis was pale. "I locked it, I swear, last night before I went upstairs." "It wasn't you," Venetia murmured. "I don't understand." "Why take it now?" "Because someone is cleaning house." The phrase lingered in the air like dust. Francis swallowed hard. "I think it's the same person who took the scarf." Venetia looked at her. "You're sure?" "I found the box this morning, empty again. But this time a coin." "A coin?" Francis held it out. "An old gold sovereign, worn at the edges. Dr. Eltham said the man who asked for laudanum paid in gold," Venetia whispered. They both turned slowly to the staircase. Above them, the hallway stretched toward the west wing. Unused, quiet, dusty. Or rather, it had been dusty. Now faint drag marks marred the floor near the end of the corridor. Inspector Drayle and Miss Marple arrived half an hour later. Mrs. Venn hesitated when they asked about the west wing. "It's been locked since the war," she said. "No one uses it." "Then you won't mind if we have a look," Drayle replied. Mrs. Venn hesitated. "I suppose not." He took the key from her hand before she could change her mind. The west wing smelled of mothballs and age. Wallpaper curled from damp corners, and every step creaked underfoot. At the far end, behind a faded green door, they found it, a makeshift bed, a tin kettle. A shaving mirror cracked across the surface, and a coat hanging from a peg, a navy wool coat embroidered faintly with the initials. E. H. Drayle knelt and opened the footlocker at the foot of the cot. Inside, letters, mostly unsigned, torn receipts, one envelope sealed in wax, and at the very bottom a photograph. It was old, faded, but unmistakable Lady Cicely and a younger Edwin, arm in arm, smiling stiffly, marked on the back in pencil, "Summer before the fall." Miss Marple read the wax-sealed letter silently, then handed it to Drayle, "To be opened only if harm should come to me. I do not return in anger. I return in shame. I wronged Cicely." But I was denied the right to atone. If she disinherits me publicly, I accept it. But if she is taken before she files the change, I will claim what I can. I will not be erased again. E.C.H. Drayle stood slowly. So he came back, and she intended to disinherit him a second time. Miss Marple nodded. But this time legally, which made it irreversible. And he killed her. We don't yet know that, but he had motive, and from the look of it, he had opportunity. Outside the wind turned cool. Miss Marple stood on the gravel path and looked toward the garden's far corner. Among the hedges something flashed, a figure, watching, then gone. Inside the hall, Frances found another note on her pillow. You brought them here. You don't know what you've done. The ledger is mine now. Stay silent, or you'll join the garden. Frances trembled, but this time she did not cry. She slipped the note into her apron and went straight to Miss Marple. The mystery was no longer just about inheritance. It was about identity, about revenge, about being forgotten, and forcing the world to remember. Miss Marple looked up at the darkening sky. They were no longer hunting a murderer. They were unearthing a ghost. Chapter 11. Storm clouds gathered above St. Elmswood, as though summoned by conscience. The village had grown quiet in the way a household does when someone is missing, but no one wants to be the first to say so aloud. At Elmridge Hall, a sense of tension hung in every corridor. The air had turned from grief to suspicion, then something darker still, and somewhere in the old West Wing a ghost waited. Inspector Drayle had stationed a constable at the foot of the staircase, though there was little confidence left that a man who had hidden in plain sight for weeks would be spooked by a uniform. Miss Marple returned to the hall just after 3. Her expression was calm, as always, but her step had urgency behind it. She asked to see the mirror. It had been moved during the war, one of Lady Cicely's prized possessions, a French gilt frame from her mother's estate. It hung now in the upstairs guest bedroom, rarely used. Miss Marple examined it quietly, then stepped aside and looked again, then frowned. Curious, she murmured. Drayle glanced up. What? She tapped the edge. This mirror was polished recently. It's covered in dust, not the glass, the frame. And there's something else. She gestured for the inspector to stand beside her. Tell me what you see. My reflection. Yes, but look closer. Look to your left shoulder. He squinted. There's a ripple. Slight warping. It's not glass. It's silvered. Tin. Thin, imperfect. The sort used in decoy furnishings. Mirrors that distort. Why would someone care about that? Miss Marple said nothing. She stepped into the corridor, found a lamp, and returned. Holding it just so, she angled the light across the mirror's surface. A faint set of fingerprints bloomed in the silver wash. Elongated, smeared. Someone stood here recently, long enough to press both hands on the wall. Possibly after removing something from behind the mirror. Drayle reached around, found the concealed edge, and with effort pulled. The mirror swung open on stiff hinges. Behind it, a recess, empty, but the imprint of a rectangular box still marked the dust. Drayle swore under his breath. What was kept? Here, letters, Miss Marple said softly. Lady Cicely never trusted safes. She told me once that truth could be hidden better in plain sight, so long as no one looked for it in the right way. Downstairs, Venetia stood in the drawing-room, staring at the garden. She did not turn when Miss Marple entered. "You knew he was here," Miss Marple said. Venetia's shoulders tensed. "I suspected. Yet you said nothing. I was afraid of what it meant, of what he might do." Miss Marple stepped closer. "When did you first see him?" 2 nights before. Cicely died. I saw a figure slip into the garden at dusk. I thought I imagined it. Then the scarf went missing. Then the spoon. You thought it was Francis. "I wanted it to be Francis," Venetia whispered, "because the truth would mean I'd watched someone die, when I might have stopped it." Miss Marple studied her. "You still can." Francis, meanwhile, sat in the stables beside the kettle, hands clenched tightly in her lap. She'd found something in the hay earlier. A matchbook from a London hotel. Unremarkable, save for the hand-drawn number penciled inside. She didn't recognize the handwriting, but she recognized the paper. It matched the note she'd received. "You brought them here." She brought it to Miss Marple that evening. Miss Marple examined it in silence, then looked up. "Francis, where exactly did you say you found this?" "Beneath the feed sack, near the garden door." "And was the door unlocked?" "No, miss. Bolted from inside. Always is." "Then someone was already in the house, hiding in plain sight." That night, a plan was set in motion. Miss Marple sat once more in the upstairs guest-room, tea untouched, lamp lit low. She held the matchbook beside the mirror and watched. The distorted reflection shift as the candlelight flickered. Then, very quietly, she said aloud, "Funny, isn't it, about reflections? They only show what we expect to see. But some things, some people, aren't meant to be seen at all." She waited. No answer. Then a creak behind the nursery door. A shadow moved. Miss Marple did not turn. "You've gone to great lengths, Edwin. Poisoned your sister. Staged a second death to shift suspicion. Hid letters. Destroyed the scarf. Took the ledger. And yet you left one trace behind." The door opened slowly. "Not in a cup," she continued, "but in a mirror." The figure stepped forward, gaunt, hollow-eyed, the coat now worn inside out. You couldn't bear to see yourself reflected, could you? You couldn't stand the face you'd become. He didn't speak. Miss Marple stood. "But even if no mirror shows you, I see you now." And in that moment he broke. Chapter 12. Edwin Hawthorne did not run. Instead, he stood there in the soft yellow lamplight of the guest-room, hollow as the man he'd once pretended to be. His eyes, grey, cold, and exhausted, were fixed not on Miss Marple, but on the warped mirror behind her, as though seeking in it a version of himself that no longer existed. "I thought you'd come sooner," he said at last, voice thin as tissue. "She was always clever. I assumed she'd told someone." "She told no one," Miss Marple replied. "But she wrote it down, and you were too angry to destroy it all." Edwin blinked slowly. "She forgave me," he whispered. "She told me she wanted to help me, but she still locked me out of the will." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting." Inspector Drayle entered then, Francis just behind him. The girl stood frozen in the doorway, her gaze flicking from Edwin's face to the coat, to the hollow in the man's chest that no threat could fill. He didn't resist as Drayle stepped forward. But he looked past them, past the law, past the village, past the world, and said, "I only wanted to be seen." Francis's voice was very quiet. "We did see you. That's why you're here." Later, in the drawing-room, Miss Marple sat with Venetia and Mrs. Venn. The storm had broken at last, rain lashing against the window-panes, a rhythm like memory against glass. Venetia had not spoken in nearly 10 minutes. It was Mrs. Venn who broke the silence. "You knew," she said, not accusing, but sad. "You knew something was wrong from the start." Miss Marple nodded. "The lilies told me." Venetia blinked. "The lilies?" They gave off the wrong scent, bitter and unfamiliar, mixed with the faintest note of decay. A gardener would have noticed. So would Lady Cicely. Venetia leaned forward, hands clenched. Why did she let him in? He was her brother, and though she hated what he had become, there was still a part of her, some old loyalty, that wanted to offer him closure. But when she told him of the will, when she explained she could not undo what he'd done to their name, he made a choice. Mrs. Venn's voice shook. The tea, yes. He'd been preparing for days. A slow build of Conin, masking it in the same blend she took nightly. He chose something she wouldn't question. Venetia's face crumpled. She was going to make things right. She already had, Miss Marple said gently. She left you the truth, Venetia. In her ledger, in the amended will, she trusted you would find it if things went wrong. And Colonel Bryce? Miss Marple's eyes darkened. Edwin feared Bryce had seen too much, perhaps even recognized him, so he poisoned his cup as well, but with cyanide. A more efficient silence. Later that night, in her cottage, Miss Marple stared out into the rain, a blanket over her knees, her notebook finally closed. The case was ending, but the pattern lingered, a man forgotten by history, a sister unable to rewrite the past. 2 deaths, 1 forgery, and a mirror that never quite reflected the truth. Some poisons are swallowed, others are swallowed by time, she whispered to herself. The past always finds a way in, through the ivy, through the letters, through the people who won't let it rest. She rose and turned off the lamp, but before sleep she added one last note to her margin. It is not death that haunts a house. It is what we leave undone. The next morning the sun rose clean over Elmridge. Drayle departed with Edwin Hawthorne in custody. No trial was needed. He had confessed in full, though without flourish. He would live out his final days under care, declared mentally unwell, unable to distinguish guilt from grief. The villagers never spoke his name again. The death of Colonel Bryce was ruled murder. So was Lady Cicely's, but no one blamed Venetia. In time she would inherit the house, and with it its silence. Frances returned to the gardens. She planted foxglove where the lilies had once bloomed, and in the vicarage a new sermon was written, one about repentance. In the post office, Dora Melling found a single envelope addressed to Miss Marple. No return address. Inside was the missing letter, never posted. It read, "You were right not to trust me, Cicely, but you were wrong to believe I'd vanish quietly. I return not to beg, but to remind you. Family can be erased from the will, but never from the blood. Eudora sent it on. Miss Marple received it in silence, placed it in her desk drawer, and made herself a modest cup of tea. She took it without sugar, without milk, and most importantly, without bitterness. Chapter 13. The Elmridge Church Bells, told gently that Sunday morning. Rain had rinsed the village clean, and now the air carried a freshness that felt almost indulgent, unearned, but welcome. Miss Marple stood just outside the churchyard gate, watching the townsfolk gather with tentative smiles and tentative shoes, still wary of the damp. Inside the church, a new sermon was being delivered, not about sin, not about wrath, but about mercy. Miss Marple didn't go in. She didn't need to. Instead, she turned and walked the longer way round the edge of the village, where hedgerows, bent under the weight of last night's downpour, and the lane turned to soft gravel. Her steps were slow but steady. She had an appointment. Francis was waiting on the south lawn of Elmridge Hall, beside the freshly pruned foxgloves. The girl looked stronger now, not healed, not yet, but untethered at last from the breathless hush she'd carried since her employer's death. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said. "I made you a promise," Miss Marple said simply. They sat together on a bench. The garden, for all its grandeur, felt different now, less curated, more alive. A space not for posing, but for growing. Frances held something in her lap, a small wooden box. "She kept this locked in the cupboard," she said, "and I found the key after everything, in a sewing tin of all places." Inside was a single photograph. Lady Cicely, younger, perhaps 23, stood arm in arm with a boy of about 15. Both wore riding clothes. Both smiled wide, unguarded. "That's Edwin?" Miss Marple asked. Francis nodded. "They used to be inseparable, before the war, before he took the money, and before the accident." Francis hesitated. "Accident?" Miss Marple took a breath. "You see, it was never proven in court. But Edwin was driving the car, the one that overturned, the crash that killed their mother. Cicely never told anyone, not even the family solicitor. But she did tell her vicar, and she wrote it down. She covered for him. She thought it was mercy." Inside the hall, Venetia stood before the great fireplace, reading the final page of the revised will. Her name had replaced Edwin's. So had several local charities, and a quiet endowment to a girls' school in Sussex. Miss Marple and Francis entered quietly. Venetia looked up. "I owe you more than I can say." "You owe me nothing," Miss Marple replied, "but perhaps you owe yourself a little peace." Venetia gestured to the envelope beside the ledger. There was one more letter. Cicely never posted it either. It was addressed to you. Miss Marple opened it gently. "Dear Miss Marple, I suspect, should you be reading this, you've done what I could not. Edwin once told me that family is just a story we retell, until no one can remember what really happened. I suppose I hoped. He might be wrong. If you are reading this, I ask only one thing. Do not let Frances carry the burden. She was always the one who listened when no one else heard. You saw me, didn't you? Even before I asked for help. You always did have a way, With shadows, thank you. Cicely Miss Marple closed the letter. She forgave too much, Venetia murmured. No, Miss Marple said softly. She forgave exactly enough. By evening, Miss Marple was back in her cottage, lighting a candle on the kitchen table and watching the flame hold its shape. The ledger, the letters, even the poison labels were locked away now, given over to, Inspector Drayle, who had promised her quietly that Edwin would never again walk through any garden. She sipped her tea slowly, this time with a single sugar cube. The silence in her home was no longer filled with questions, only memories. A week later, Francis sent her a note. The lilies are gone. The foxgloves bloom stronger than ever. Thank you. F. Miss Marple folded the paper neatly and placed it in her drawer. Then she opened a fresh page in her notebook and wrote, Some mysteries do not ask to be solved. They ask to be witnessed. She closed the notebook. The rain had not returned, and neither, thank heaven, had Edwin Hawthorne.